Thank you everybody for coming. Good morning. Welcome to the Alumni Festival. I've been asked to remind you that this morning's session is recorded, so just bear that in mind. First and foremost, I am Jacob Forward. I'm just starting the third year of my history PhD here at Cambridge, King's College. And I should really be writing up, but I'm here talking to you all, so there we go. And what I'm going to share with you today is a project that I was working on last year with a team of a few other people, experts in machine learning, in history, in archival sources, digital humanities. This project was called Speaking with Our Sources. And the remit was really to experiment with large language models. Perhaps I should clarify a bit what I mean by AI in the context of this debate. AI is a very capacious acronym that's been around since the 1950s and has been used to describe many different technologies. But what I and most other people mean when we say AI these days is generative and predictive machine learning based on high-dimensional data sets. Things like large language models, image generation models. Many of you will be familiar with ChatGPT and other consumer-facing applications. So the remit of this project was to explore how large language models might impact the field of history and be useful as a research tool. And we chose to focus on two large corpora of speeches from former presidents Roosevelt and Reagan. They're about 3 million words each, pretty much everything they said on public record in their time in office. And we chose these two characters because they're really titans of two different political orders in the 20th century. The New Deal order of FDR and the neoliberal order of Reagan. And we thought that it would be amazing to have a debate between these two great paradigms in American political history. And with our AI techniques, we hope that something like that is possible. Clearly, it's not going to be a traditional debate because there's nothing in the FDR source material that refers to Reagan. So I think of it more as an, at times, adversarial discussion between these two perspectives. Crucially, every response you hear in the debate that I'm about to play is based pretty much verbatim on snippets from their original speeches. So we're not really putting words in their mouth, we're actually trying to compile, using the AI to compile their original speeches to offer answers to the questions that I ask. I also used a voice cloning technique, perhaps a little bit theatrically and not academically, for this experiment. So you'll hear a rather poor voice clone of FDR reading out the text and a better one of Reagan. That's partly because the audio recordings are so different for these two presidents. With FDR, there's very, very little available, and what does exist is very low quality. I actually had to edit out the sound of bombers flying overhead in the recording I used for FDR. I also cloned my own voice, so it's going to sound a little bit strange, but I thought, in the spirit of things, I just do that. So what I'm about to share with you is really an experiment. Think of it as an experiment in presenting and interacting with historical sources in a new way, while hopefully respecting the accuracy of those historical sources. And we'll talk a little bit more about that after the debate, and also there'll be a live demo of the tool, and I'll talk a little bit more about the technology behind it. But for now, let's move on to the debate.
Good evening and welcome to the AI presidential debate with Presidents Franklin Roosevelt.
Good evening.
And Ronald Reagan.
Good evening.
President Roosevelt, President Reagan, you both took office during severe economic crises. What fundamentally is your view of the government's role in addressing economic hardship?
When I took the oath of office, our nation faced a profound economic crisis. The forces of deflation had resulted in an almost complete collapse of our economic activities. We were confronted with a critical choice. We could let nature take its course and gamble on building from the ruins, or we could take decisive action. I rejected the philosophy of inaction and indifference. My fundamental view is that the government has a continuing responsibility to its citizens. We owe a duty to see that no one should starve who is willing to work but unable to find employment. The government cannot simply stand by while Americans suffer. I do not believe government should take over everything. But when private agencies and local communities cannot bear the burden, the state and federal government must step in. We put the power of government behind not only banks and railroads, but industrial workers, farmers, small homeowners, the unemployed, and young people who suffered from a lack of opportunity. Our approach was not about creating permanent government operations, but about providing a lifeline during a critical time. When Americans suffered, we refused to pass by on the other side. Humanity came first. This is the essence of responsible governance, to protect the economic welfare of all people in all sections and all groups.
Thank you. President Reagan.
When I took office, America was in the worst economic mess since the days of Franklin Roosevelt. But I came to Washington with a fundamental belief. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. We found an economy strangled by decades of taxing and spending, with double-digit inflation destroying people's savings and brutally attacking those on fixed incomes. We must restore the balance by allowing the private sector to provide jobs and create wealth, not dependency. Many big government programs had noble intentions, but they marked a departure from creating opportunity to creating dependency. What Americans need most is more enterprise, a bigger economic opportunity, and the freedom to work hard and succeed.
President Roosevelt, how do you respond to the idea that government programs create dependency, not opportunity?
I reject entirely the notion that government programs create dependency. In fact, they create opportunity. When humane considerations are concerned, Americans give them precedence. I will never condemn millions of men and women to the dry rot of idleness on the dole. My administration has established agencies not to weaken the human spirit, but to substitute hope for dull despair, work for idleness. The lessons of history show that continued dependence upon relief can indeed induce a spiritual disintegration. But that is precisely why our programs are designed to provide meaningful work, not mere handouts. Never will I simply hand out market baskets of groceries. Instead, we are creating real work that has permanent usefulness to communities. Our goal is not to weaken the national fiber, but to strengthen it by giving able-bodied workers the dignity of productive labor. We are not administering a narcotic, but providing a pathway to economic recovery and personal dignity.
President Reagan, you championed deregulation. How do you measure the proper balance between market freedom and government oversight?
We came to believe that government was more the problem than the solution. The massive growth of government spending was weighing down the private sector, and huge increases in regulations were stifling individual initiative and destroying opportunity for our people. I've always held it as an article of faith that freedom works. The key is to limit unnecessary regulations while maintaining essential protections that a compassionate society must provide. When we entered the 1980s, America needed a new birth of economic freedom. We reduced the Federal Register to just a little more than half its original size, eliminating some 600 million man-hours a year of work just filling out government forms. This isn't about eliminating all government oversight. It's about creating a balance where free people and a free economy can work their magic. We are unique as a federation of sovereign states, with much of our law left to local communities nearest to the people. The federal government should step in only where truly necessary.
President Roosevelt, how do you respond to this idea that government is the problem, that regulations stifle economic growth and productivity?
Some talk endlessly about what government ought not do, particularly those who were quite happy to have government bail out financial institutions and railroads back in 1933. But the truth is, we do not assume all we have done is right or completely successful, yet our economic and social program has given the United States a more stable and less artificial prosperity than any other nation in the world. We must have a sense of proportion and perspective, and above all, goodwill in addressing our economic challenges.
You have both faced authoritarian regimes, fascist and communist. What, if any, advantages does a democratic country have in confronting authoritarian adversaries?
We cannot carelessly assume that merely having a democratic form of government makes us strong. A democracy must become a positive force in the daily lives of its people, demonstrating that it truly cares for the security of every individual. Our strength lies in our ability to maintain internal unity while remaining tolerant and militant. Militant in maintaining liberty against social oppression at home and military aggression abroad. An autocracy may seem efficient, but a democracy that moves forward, seeking day and night by peaceful means to better the lot of its citizens, has a moral and practical resilience that rigid systems cannot match. Our role is not just to resist, but to persuade other nations to return to the ways of peace and goodwill, demonstrating through our example the superior strength of democratic principles.
You know, people often wonder whether democratic leaders accountable to their people aren't at a disadvantage when negotiating with totalitarian states. But I can speak from personal experience. Our greatest advantage is the strength of free people, an informed and enlightened populace resolved to remain free. Totalitarian regimes are inherently weak, despite their appearances of strength. Their hold on power is limited to police-state repression. They fear the unquenchable human aspiration to control one's own destiny. Democratic governments have a hidden strength that no authoritarian regime can match: the courage and resilience of free people. Freedom itself is the issue, our own and the entire world's, and America remains that shining city on a hill, a beacon of hope for millions who yearn to break free from tyranny.
How do you each view America's ideal role in the world? Is America's mission best advanced through supporting international institutions like the United Nations, or by focusing on American sovereignty and strength?
We cannot attain our great objectives by ourselves, but we must also preserve our independence. Our mission is to join with other nations in a way that does not diminish our sovereignty or integrity. The world needs a mechanism for nations to talk things over, to stop aggression before it begins. If we do not catch the international felon when we have our hands on him, if we let him escape because of bureaucratic hesitation, then we are not doing our share to prevent another world war. The power this nation has attained, political, economic, military, and above all moral, brings with it a responsibility for leadership in the community of nations. We stand before the world as one people united in a common determination to uphold an ideal of human society where conscience is superior to brute strength, where freedom substitutes force in the governments of the world.
America's role in the world is not a choice between international institutions and national strength. It is about advancing freedom through both. We are a global power with global responsibilities, and this is a role thrust upon us by history and the hopes of those who aspire to freedom throughout the world. The United Nations is an important institution, but not a perfect one. While it hasn't solved every problem, it can be a force for great good. We can be proud that America remains mankind's best hope. The eyes of the world are on us, counting on us to protect peace, promote prosperity, and provide a better world. This we can do by remaining strong, by supporting international cooperation where possible, but always maintaining our commitment to liberty and our national ideals. As I've said, destiny is much more than geography. We cannot ignore our global responsibilities, for any retreat would endanger both our national ideals and our national interests.
Both of you have spoken of an American dream. How would you define this concept, and what role should the government play in helping citizens achieve it?
The American dream is not about accumulating vast personal wealth, as it might have been in older days. In the past, people dreamed of the golden ladder, each individual climbing for himself. But the newer generation of America has a different vision. We place emphasis on sufficiency of life rather than a plethora of riches. I see an America where factory workers are not discarded after they reach their prime, where there is no endless chain of poverty from generation to generation. An America where impoverished farmers do not become homeless wanderers, where youth is not a beggar for a job. Americans do not see government as an interloper, but as the most effective form of organized self-help. We are building a dream of a greater and finer America, blessed with material and spiritual abundance that makes man's life truly rich.
The American dream is a living, breathing reality that belongs to millions of hearts and can be fulfilled in millions of different ways. It's a dream of a land where every citizen is judged not by color, religion, or sex, but solely on individual merit. It's a dream where every woman and man is free to become all that she or he can be. The government's role is not to control or dictate this dream, but to get out of the way and unlock the spirit and energy of our people. We must ensure that the federal government doesn't soak up the lion's share of our gross national product or choke off technology with excessive regulations. Instead, we should provide incentives that will drive Americans to dream, dare, and take greater risks for a greater good. Remember, there are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams. From the sidewalks of Harlem to the mountaintops of Hawaii, the American dream lives on.
What was your motivation for entering politics? And what is your favorite memory of your time in office?
I never meant to go into politics. For about 25 years, I was very happy in my previous line of work. As a sports announcer, an actor in Hollywood. I always believed you pay your way for the blessings bestowed on you, so I would campaign for candidates I believed in and help at fundraisers. My entry into politics came almost by accident. After making a speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964 that attracted national attention, the Republican Party kept approaching me to run for governor of California. At first, I literally threw them out of the house, but they persisted, and one night, Nancy and I found we couldn't sleep. They convinced me I had an obligation and that I could win. I was a reluctant entrant into public life. I never dreamed I would seek office, but I came to believe that public office shouldn't be viewed as just a good job. You have to believe you can bring about improvement and do good for the government. As for my favorite memory, it's hard to choose. But one of my proudest moments was appointing Sandra Day O'Connor as the first woman in history to serve on the United States Supreme Court. I loved being president, loved the bully pulpit of the office, and loved looking out for the interests of our country. I discovered that what I thought would be a dull job was actually incredibly fulfilling. We, the people, are the driver, and the government is the car, and together we decide where this great nation should go.
I was essentially kidnapped into public life, quite by accident. As I recall, in August of a particular year, I hadn't the foggiest idea I was going to run for the state senate. It was another band of kidnappers who essentially pushed me into this path. When I first entered politics, I found myself among other young men in the legislature who shared a common philosophy, men like Bob Wagner and Al Smith. We did not view government as something separate from the people, but as a tool to be used by the people for their own good. My motivation was never personal aggrandizement. I like to think that most American presidents see their office as an opportunity for service rather than for party interests. We place the good of the nation always ahead of the good of the party, using party mechanics when helpful, but dropping mere partisanship when it diverged from national interests.
What has the support of the First Lady meant to you during your time in office?
Mrs. Roosevelt has been an incredible support throughout my time in office. Everywhere we go, she is with me in spirit, even when she cannot be physically present. When I travel, she often sends her warmest greetings. We are very much a team. Her support goes beyond public appearances. She is my partner, deeply invested in our work and our connection to the American people. Whether we're traveling across the country or hosting guests, Mrs. Roosevelt is an integral part of everything we do.
Thank you, President Reagan.
What do you say about someone who gives your life meaning? What do you say about someone who's always there with support and understanding? Someone who makes sacrifices so that your life will be easier and more successful? Well, what you say is that you love that person and treasure her. The presidency wouldn't have been the joy it's been for me without Nancy beside me. When I look back on these days, I'll remember her radiance and her strength, her support. She's been more than a wife, she's been a partner. Every president should be so lucky. She once said that a president has all kinds of advisors and experts who look after his interests, but no one who looks after his needs as a human being. Well, Nancy has done that for me through recuperations and crises. I think it's all too common in marriages that no matter how much partners love each other, they don't thank each other enough. And I suppose I don't thank Nancy enough for all that she does for me. But I want the world to know Nancy Reagan is my everything.
And lastly, what gives you hope when times are dark?
In these dark times, my hope springs from an unquenchable spirit that transcends the lines of nation and conflict. I believe that the spirit of unselfish service makes an appeal to the inner conscience of every man and woman on earth. It lives even in the midst of war and slavery, surviving all prohibitions and decrees. I have faith that the value of love will always be stronger than the value of hate. Any nation that employs hatred will ultimately be torn to pieces by that very hatred. We of the United States have the adventurous courage, vision, and will needed to build a world order that can justify the tremendous sacrifices now being made. Our Earth is but a small star in the great universe, yet of it we can make, if we choose, a planet unvexed by war, untroubled by hunger or fear, undivided by senseless distinctions. The spirit of man has awakened, and the soul of man has gone forth. We shall follow the light, as our forefathers did, to the fulfillment of our hopes for victory, for freedom, and for peace.
Hope is not just an emotion. It is the highest reality, the age-old power that has bettered the lot of humankind across centuries. Even when the world seems to be turning into a wilderness, when we hear the approaching thunder that threatens to destroy us, I believe it will all come right. History teaches us to hope, for it teaches us about man and the irrepressible human spirit. Some may dismiss such optimism as simplistic idealism, pointing to the burdens of our modern world, the famines, plagues, wars, and invasions. But isn't that a narrow view? What truly shines from the pages of history are the daring of dreamers and the deeds of builders and doers. We must not take counsel of our fears. Instead, we must offer the world a politics of hope, a forward strategy for freedom. Everywhere across the globe, in the shipyards of Gdansk, the hills of Nicaragua, the rice paddies of Kampuchea, the cry is liberty. When we proclaim our faith in God and the dignity of man, when we affirm our love of freedom, we give hope to every freedom-loving soul. The life of each individual can change the world and make it better. We are not merely here to endure, but to prevail. And that is why, even in the darkest times, I remain convinced that peace and tranquility will return again.
That was that. Well, it never ceases to amaze me. It never ceases to amaze me just how much the tone of American presidential politics has shifted in recent years. It's really quite inspirational stuff. And also, one has to bear in mind that you're hearing very much the public-facing version of what they think about things. So I'm always struck by the glowing terms with which FDR talks about his relationship to his wife. I mean, he famously had an affair with her secretary, who was then fired, and it was a very difficult marriage. I think their son described it as an armed truce. So you can, to hear him saying that, I mean, of course, this is what he would say in public-facing situations, but you notice the tonal difference between how he speaks about his wife and how Reagan speaks, and it's really quite remarkable. I also find it interesting how many points they seem to agree on in terms of America's role in the world, perhaps. There's not that much disalignment in foreign policy, so that also strikes me when I listen to this. Let me give you a bit more context on this project and why we undertook it. One of the reasons we undertook this project was to address a real challenge in the field of history at the moment, which is the source abundance problem. So the last 30 years has seen an immense proliferation of sources in the digital sphere, and that's partly through the process of digitization, which has been going on for a long time, and increasingly born digital sources. And this poses, a real problem. As early as the late 1990s, by one illustrative estimate, the Clinton White House was producing 6 million emails a year. And of course, that problem has only escalated. Gone are these neat packets and logically organized files and folders of the great bureaucracies and institutions of the 20th century. And we're left with a kind of digital haystack of information in which it's really very difficult to find the information we might be looking for, especially now that our government ministers are communicating with each other via encrypted WhatsApp chat and that kind of thing. And I'm even amazed to find that the National Archives and Records Administration in the States, as of June 30th last year, are no longer accepting physical records into their holdings. All government departments have to send them digital records. So the future of archival research is going to be very much digital. This poses a huge problem to anyone interested in manual search. The process of going into an archive, as I've done at some points in my academic career, and sifting through folders and looking up folders, and that I think is no longer going to be possible with the scale of information we're talking about. And of course, lexical search or word search has stepped into the breach as the technology that the majority of humanities and social science scholars now use to find information. But there are numerous issues with lexical search. One is that you're really speaking the language of the computer rather than your own language when it comes to phrasing questions or trying to find information. Because the technology is based on exact character matching. So it matches the string of characters you input with strings of characters in the data set and returns results. And of course, you do have regex or wildcard searching, which can broaden the scope of what you retrieve a little bit, but it's not great. And you're very much speaking the language of the computer. And so the question emerges, what if you could ask really open-ended questions, like the questions you heard me ask in the debate, of our archives? What if we could speak with our sources in a much more human-like language, with all the nuance that full human language can convey? And the answer is that with vector search, something like that becomes possible. Now, vector search has been around for a while, since the 70s and 80s, I believe, and it was first used by scientists for recording high-dimensional DNA data and searching through large repositories of DNA data. But the real breakthrough moment in the digital humanities came in 2013, when Google released a model called word-to-vec, word-to-vector, which enables scholars to start vectorizing large data sets of speech and language. And that really unlocked a lot of interesting research. And of course, large language models have massively popularized embedding models, because embedding isn't... large language models can't directly access human language. The language has to be translated into numbers first, and what they're really doing is mapping numerical relations. So embedding, what is embedding? Embedding is representing written language numerically as vectors in a high-dimensional vector space. It's very hard to imagine things in high dimensions. So this is just a little three-dimensional example here. Each axis represents a characteristic of the information that we're trying to embed or store in numbers. So in this example, we're trying to embed the characteristics of fruit. And these axes describe different characteristics. We've got acidity, redness, and sweetness. And you can assign each of the fruits a little score based on how it scores on these three axes. And taken together, that score describes a direction through three-dimensional space. And that direction is a vector. That's all that a vector really is. It's a direction through space. But that starts to enable some pretty cool things, because you can look at the angle between the vector of the banana and the vector of the strawberry, and that angle says something about the similarity of those two concepts. The smaller the angle, the more similar the two embedded pieces of information are. And this is a measurement called cosine similarity, which is a very popular measurement in vector search. So what we do is the same thing with language. Because you can imagine, with just three dimensions, you can only track so much information. But what about if we had 10 dimensions? What about if we had 100 dimensions? What if we had 1,000 dimensions? And so we, in fact, used a 1,024-dimensional embedding model. We divided all of the speeches in our corpus into 150-word chunks. 150 words seem to be about right in terms of granularity, but also enough context. And we converted each of these 150-word chunks into this high-dimensional vector. And what that enabled us to do was vector search. Here's a kind of map of the system that we designed. So we begin with our presidential speech corpora. We process the documents into these chunks. We might have to remove some special characters, or sometimes foreign languages can cause issues with the embedding process. And then we feed them into an embedding model, and that turns the language into these numerical vectors. And these numerical vectors are in turn stored in a vector database. And then comes the user and the user interaction. And what we're familiar with is just speaking to a large language model, and that's just me talking to a large language model and it replying, just with what it's learned from its pre-training. But the advantage of this process, retrieval augmented generation, is that the first step is that my prompt is embedded using the same embedding model, and that vector is then fed to the vector database, and a semantic vector search process is performed on it. And so it finds the top 100 vectors that are most closely related to the vector of the question that I asked. And it feeds all of those 100 to the large language model. We even used a re-ranking process, which whittled it down to the 50 most related. And then the large language model suddenly has accurate context with which to respond. And we gave a prompt to the large language model in this tool to only respond using verbatim the language that it found in the presidential sources. So there might be a few little words where it's kind of tweaked or massaged it together to make a coherent response, but it's overwhelmingly based on the real quotes from the presidents. And it's quite an interesting experience, being able to, quote unquote, speak with a president. You know, I remember at one point in the research where I wasn't really sure how it was going, or I was struggling with something, and I asked, I think it was FDR, about the value of perseverance. And I got this wonderful speech about the value of perseverance. So it's not usual that your archive reaches out, taps you on the shoulder, and you know, gives you encouragement to go on. So that's quite amazing. And of course, as you saw in the debate, you can ask personal questions, because they have spoken about these things on record before. It's really interesting to find out a bit more about them, and I hope that this technique will encourage more engagement with historical archives. So now I'm going to demonstrate the tool. This is not yet publicly released, but it's the search interface that I built for, with which I used to make the debate. There's a little welcome section and how it works. And then we can choose between our presidents. Let's select Reagan. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Reagan? Or AI Reagan, I should say. I'm to be clear about that distinction. Sure. You never know what it's going to say. Oh, I've got caps lock on. All right, let's see what it says. I wonder if he said anything on record about his films. He probably has. So at the moment, it's searching through the speeches. And there is a little bit of a latency issue when you're doing vector search. It's much less computationally efficient than keyword search. It's going to be read out in a second. The audio response is just coming, yeah. Here we go.
I can tell you about one that certainly gave me pause about my Hollywood career. When I packed up in an old Nash Lafayette convertible everything that I owned in the world and took off from Des Moines, my first stop that night was Cheyenne, Wyoming Racing. I checked in at a hotel, had dinner, and then I went to a movie. And the movie just happened to be a thing called A Star is Born, not the remake the first time they'd made it. Those of you who might have seen it remember that it was a picture about the horrors and the vicissitudes of someone trying to get started in Hollywood. I didn't sleep very well that night. I almost turned around and went back the other way. Now, I did make a picture called Prisoner of War that had to do with Korea and the Korean War. In that make-believe world, I had close...
It's getting a little bit slow for some reason, but that's a great question. I didn't expect that answer, of course. The key point is that in this interface, the sources, the original sources, are really highlighted. This is something, accuracy matters a lot to me as a historian, and so these are the retrieved speech excerpts that this response was based on. So it gives you a relevance score. 0.5 is on the lower side, so there can't have been anything very close to our question, but it still found that these few sources were most closely related. And there's even a link to view the original speech on the American Presidency Project website. This is an outstanding resource. I highly recommend that people check it out. And here you can see not just the chunk, but the full speech in which this anecdote was related. And there's often some provenance information, and of course the reference. And there's often a video as well of the original speech. So my hope is that that could produce a really beneficial workflow where you can rapidly ask human-like questions. The sources upon which that's based are highlighted, and then you can move from those to a deep reading of the source, which is, I think, an irreplaceable skill in history, and very, very important. We'll come back at the end in the Q&A and do some more Q&A questions. So do think if you want to ask either of the presidents anything. One other feature that I want to highlight was the date range, because when I first did this tool, there was no restriction by date. And a friend of mine said, I asked FDR about his views on isolationism, and it gave me a really weird hodgepodge mix of everything he'd said or felt over the course of his time in office. But with date range filtering, you can say, just in this year, what is the president's view on the strength of the economy? And that really helps make it more historically useful, essentially, because it's filtering down his point of view to a particular moment in time. So the date range made a big difference. But that's the long and short of the tool. Let's move back. I wanted to speak about a few of the limitations that we've encountered with this technology. One of them is censorship. So you may be familiar with, in conversation with ChatGPT or any of the large frontier models, there are certain topics that you can't stray into. It will shut you down because a lot of these large companies are very nervous about controversy and causing issues. There's a publicity nightmare for them. And so we are actually using a frontier model. It's the Claude Sonnet 4 model in our system. And so if, for instance, I asked FDR to justify the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, I think the model might not want to respond to that, even though there might be something in the archive on that. Although actually I don't think he does speak on public record about the internments, but the point stands that if you get into a controversial area, the model will often refuse to work with you. This is a real issue for colleagues of mine who work on the history of slavery and the history of the Holocaust. They simply cannot work with frontier large language models in any capacity, really, without them shutting it down or refusing to speak about this topic. So I think a case could be made for a completely uncensored, open source, but maybe restricted access large language model for academic research, because it is limiting to deal with the censorship in the model. It's better in the open source community, but the models are much smaller and less capable most of the time. And even there you have issues where little biases and things are baked into the model. For instance, the DeepSeek model that was released by a lab in China was open source, but if you tried to ask it anything about Tiananmen Square, it would shut you down quite quickly. So next, of course, is the environmental impact. This is something that lots of ethicists and scholars of AI ethics are thinking about and concerned about, rightly so. It's very energy intensive to train large language models and to host them in particular, and that means it's carbon intensive and negative for the environment. There's also been many headlines about the water consumption of these server farms, but I haven't seen any reliable statistics coming out in the press, unfortunately, on this point, because they often miss that the water is recycled in the plants. It's not constantly used from a new source. So there are issues to consider, and I think it's always worth doing a calculation as to whether the outcome merits the cost, environmentally speaking, of a piece of research. But it's also worth pointing out the other side to this, which is that academic history is a very carbon-intensive profession anyway, because you might be flying to international archives or conferences, or ordering books that have to be driven across the country. So it's not as if there's a no carbon footprint choice. Then there's the hidden labor cost. Many of these large language models are trained. They go through a second phase of training called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And that requires a lot of humans to basically look at A/B examples and select a preference to improve the model's performance over time. And as many companies do, this has tended to follow a kind of labor arbitrage model where they outsource to developing countries in often exploitative and bad working conditions with no labor rights at all. On the other hand, journalistic opinion is split on this, and some journalists regard it as a really positive new source of employment and remote work in developing economies. So it depends how it's handled. There are a few companies that are cropping up that bill themselves as ethical human AI training laboratories, essentially. So one has to think about the hidden labor cost as well. One of the questions that I'm grappling with now in my research is, what if we started to apply this technology not just to 2 corpora of 2 presidents, but to a whole archive? Would that be possible? And it turns out it's technically quite difficult because, as I mentioned, there's this latency issue. Searching through vector space is quite computationally intensive. It takes time. And we're used to very instantaneous responses in word search. There are all kinds of other issues as well about how to embed certain pieces of information, what chunking methodology to take. It's very complicated, but I think it's solvable. And it unlocks a really exciting future where researchers can ask questions in full sentences with all the nuance that's capable of their sources. I also think I'm very enamored with dialogue as a method for researching. It's really the oldest and the most intuitive form of information search. And so I think the more we can get into a dialogic form of interaction with our sources, the better. One last thing I wanted to comment on was something that I love about the history discipline, which is that it's part art and part science. And I'd suggest that the scientific part is more to do with the information discovery and accessing the information. And when it comes to molding and shaping that information, interpreting that information, and fashioning into a narrative that is meaningful for our times, that's really an art. And I think, on balance, I'm probably in favor of using AI for the scientific side of what we do, the information discovery, but keeping it at an arm's length from our art and from our academic writing. I think that we might see a future in the next 3 to 5 years where historians can be much more efficient in their information search. They can access new information, discover new links, hidden connections, and so it'll make them much more productive. But I hope that they spend the same time as they do now, or perhaps even more, thinking deeply about their findings and luxuriating in the joyful slowness of writing about it. So thank you very much. Let's move on to a Q&A session. Yes?
Really interesting. I'm curious about...
Oh, just the microphone's coming.
Sorry. It's very interesting, thank you. I'm really curious about the tonal variation in the way in which somebody says something. So if I said, how are you, versus how are you, versus how are you, it's all completely different. So I'm just curious what you've noticed about that.
In regard to this tool?
Yeah, thinking about how you're feeding in information, but you're also getting them to say out loud their responses, but the way in which they say their responses may be of value. I'm not sure what your thoughts are about that.
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, the tonal inflection, shall we say, is a little bit haphazard and uncontrollable and not authentic. And so I'd be a bit worried about reading too much into how the text is vocalized, because that's just using quite a simplistic voice cloning tool, which I really wanted for engagement and immersion rather than for genuine research reasons. I think we should look at the tone in the original text because that's what stays the same. And doing close reading and deep reading of that as a historian, I think that's where we can more reliably gain insights. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Is there any way when you code text that you can code a value for sarcasm or whatever against a set of words?
That's a really interesting question. In the transcripts of a lot of these press conferences, the transcriber records the reaction of the audience in square brackets. And so they'll say laughter or applause. And that unlocks all kinds of exciting possibilities. I want to, for instance, at some point, do a study on presidential humor. Because if you just look for these square bracket laughter moments and then look at the surrounding text, you could have this amazing resource of presidential humor across the ages. And I think that could be quite an interesting little article or something. But whether one can encode emotion, yes and no. I mean, there are these things called emotion classification models, which take in a sentence and decide how it scores on anger, joy, fear, something like that. But I'm not sure that you can add that score. Maybe you could to the vector embedding. You've given me something to think about. Thank you.
Why did you choose 1,024 attributes, and how much of that process of allocation is automated?
So 1,024 is a bit of an odd number. It's a factor of 2. So in computing, factors of 2 are generally easier to run calculations on. We started quite small with some open source embedding models, but they just really weren't performing very well. And then we moved up to the free tier of some of a private embedding model, I think with Voyage AI, quite a good company. And that offered us access to these 1,024 embedding models, and the performance just jumped through the roof in terms of the accuracy of the information retrieval. And that felt like a good point to stop. I mean, going further, the performance increase tails off quite quickly when you're embedding information chunks of this size. But that was quite a conscious choice, and we experimented with that a bit, and also with hybrid search, where you combine vector search with keyword search, because it can be important sometimes to look for a specific quote or a specific name in a data set, and vector search isn't well suited for that. So yeah, we experimented quite a bit. So.
I don't think you told us what any of the 1,024 dimensions were.
Well, that's because they are not human interpretable. They are completely random. So basically, when you're training an embedding model, the embedding model learns what dimensions are useful to embed a piece of information, and they don't really relate to things that we can understand, because some of them relate to grammar, some of them relate to tense, some of them relate to emotion, some of them relate to particular sequences of words, and when you get up to 1,000 dimensions, it's actually not meaningful. It's really hard to decipher in human terms what those dimensions mean. It's arbitrary when it begins, and it trains, and yeah, it's a very interesting process. Yes. Right.
And you literally made this black box that is just described to us just now that you can't really explain or understand it. Is that it?
Well, the black box aspect that I was just referring to is at the level of the dimensions of the embedding model. There is interpretability on the input level, where we know what sources we're putting in, and there's interpretability on the output level, where we see what sources it was using. So it's really just to perform the vector search that we're not quite sure what's going on. But I say all of this, there's some really exciting science going on at the moment, and I'm actually involved in a project on what's called activation analysis on large language models. So when you have a neural network and you train it on a data set, you can start to look at some of the activation clusters in the neural network, and those actually relate to concepts that we can start to understand and we can test. And so there's a lot of encouraging signs that we're going to be able to interpret what's going on more and more within the black box of a digital neural network to great effect. I have a friend in the psychology department who is working on administering psychometric tests to large language models. And as part of that, he does activation analysis. So he can tell by analyzing the distribution of activations what sort of a personality it fits into across these different metrics. So we are getting a peek increasingly into the black box. But I think in this particular application, it's not an issue, but good question. Sir?
You mentioned kind of approaching whole archives. Are there certain questions which are that wouldn't have as many delays? Like if you're asking a question regarding economics, where the data is probably a bit neater than, say, beliefs on the American dream. Are there certain approaches towards archives that are a bit more straightforward?
That's an interesting question. It's not really to do with the complexity of the question, but rather the size of the vector database. That's the limiting factor. So there may be ways to kind of take in a question and then triage it and see which portion of the vector database it might relate to. So you could write a question, a large language model could categorize it as, this is an economics question. And then it would redirect that question to perform a vector search across a sub-component of the overall data set, which is focused on those sources. And that would be a way of approaching the latency issue. But yeah, it is quite complicated, yeah. So. Yes, well, systemic bias is my friend as a historian. I study systemic bias. I'm a discourse analyst. That's what I didn't really mention what I did in my PhD. I'm focused on the presidential discourse from the end of the Cold War until Trump's first election in 2017, and the theme of crisis in presidential communication. And so actually, it's precisely a large language model's capacity to assume and take on the biases of the sources that's interesting to me, because when I then study the output of the large language model, I'm able to study something about the thinking and the biases of the person it purports to represent. So it's actually interesting and valuable to me, bias, in the right context. So.
Have you tried asking questions about contemporary politics and use words like Trumpism and climate change in vocab that they understand?
Not in vocab they won't understand, but when I tried asking about contemporary issues, if you ask FDR about the moon landing, the large language model will produce a little message saying, there were no sources returned on this, I will not respond, something like that. So I made sure that we don't branch off into counterfactuals. And to the gentleman's question just before you, I think it's really important that this tool fosters a closer engagement with the actual sources, which I think it can do, rather than creating kind of synthetic sources or another layer of interpretation. So, yes.
Oh, crikey, never been on one of these before. Is there a possibility that certain political actors, I'm just thinking of the political use of this, could be astounding. You say it can't pronounce on current issues at the moment, but what if someone inputted it so it could, and they tried to, well, get themselves the endorsement of George Washington, say, or someone. I'm serious. Or where are my notes, Dad? Can you get to? I'm sorry, this won't be too long. Well, like, Abraham Lincoln, all these great American figures. It would be, if people believed, it doesn't have to be factual, but if they believed this is kind of the authentic voice of this person, then presumably if it pronounced on some current issues, that could be very, very powerful.
Certainly true. Certainly true, and we're seeing that. I agree with you. Voice cloning is a very dangerous technology, and we're seeing it being used a lot in deepfakes at the moment. To defraud companies and things like that. So people will produce a voice clone of the CFO and then ring someone up saying, I'm the CFO and you need to release these funds into this account. And companies have lost huge amounts of money over this. So that's the deepfake issue, which is a separate and important issue. As regards this tool, I think the voice cloning is really, just as I said, a slightly unscholarly and theatrical twist on top of it. Could it be used by bad actors for bad purposes? I think it probably could. But how much responsibility I have for stopping bad actors doing bad things, I'm not sure. This tool is not publicly released. I think it was really just for research and engagement purposes, but it's a valid question and it's an ongoing debate. Deepfakes are very problematic and threaten politics in all kinds of ways. Although I was almost surprised, actually, going through the 2024 major election year around the world, that we saw so few cases of massive scale fraud or misuse of AI. That was the big fear going into that year. And there were a few headlines here and there, but I was generally surprised by how little that cropped up. Yes, in the front.
Ask a question about the tense of the language, because in the debate, I'm assuming, like when we asked about the film, that each speech was a sort of tapestry of lots of different sources. But presumably sometimes they were speaking in the present tense, America is a great nation, or America will be a great nation, or looking back at America was a great nation. Did AI sort of smooth that over to make it consistent within each speech?
Actually, that's a great question. In the current system, it doesn't smooth at all, really. It wants to preserve verbatim the original chunks as much as possible. All it does is really read them and try to compile them as an answer. And which is why I think actually at the end of the debate, you heard Reagan talk about his time in office in the past tense. And that draws from a speech, from his leaving speech, basically. So it is case consistent. But most of the time, presidents are speaking as the president in office, talking about current affairs. So yes, good question.
I was very relieved to hear your closing remarks about the balance of art and science, because one thing that occurs to me is, does this drive us, these sorts of tools, towards a uniformity of response and interpretation? Because, I mean, sort of, I history here, and it was all about debate, disagreement, etc., and, you know, you're talking about censorship, not going into those areas because they're too difficult. What about today's undergraduates who need to learn to challenge and criticize and so on? I mean, this is fascinating and fun, you know, to get into, and incredibly insightful potentially. But yeah, you're typing in the same words and so on? I mean, this is a bigger question for the whole of AI, but what about today's students and so on? What about this disagreement, etc., etc.?
That's a good vein of questioning. I presented this tool in a lecture to some undergraduates, and I probably didn't preface it enough with explaining what it was, and a few of them were really quite concerned and came up to me afterwards and had lots of conversations about it, and it led to some really interesting new ideas and perspectives, and it really engaged them very strongly. And so I think it fosters debate, having a new technology. We have to figure out how to implement it and weave it into our lives and our research processes. I think it does foster debate. And actually, AI can be really good for drawing out differences and unique sources. So one of the things I noticed using this tool is that it can draw on really strange little peripheral presidential sources that no historian in their right mind would look at. I mean, why would you look at the opening remarks at a high school somewhere out in the Midwest? You just wouldn't look at that. But it actually might contain a really valuable sentiment or phrase from the president on a particular policy issue. And so the issue with word search, and more broadly in history, has been a tendency when it comes to presidential speeches to conflate prominence for significance. They're not quite the same thing. And so you'll see a lot of people talking about, and intellectual historians are particularly guilty of this, they tend to talk about the inauguration speeches, the State of the Union addresses, all these big canonical presidential speeches, and they take these as emblematic of the president's point of view on a topic. But actually, those are really White House scripts written by the West Wing. And if you want to get a really candid understanding of what the president's actual thought on a topic, you have to go to these little unscripted, peripheral, hidden gems of presidential rhetoric. And a tool like this really surfaces those. It pays no regard to whether a chunk came from a State of the Union address or from the opening of a high school. They have the same value, and that value is their similarity to your question. Thank you. Sir?
So I should say I'm actually heavily involved in AI, so this is a very good, thank you, it's a great talk. One of the problems we have generally is that the way AI makes decisions ends up in an output is all driven by what you put in the first place and how you prompt it. So I could put something into an AI and it'll do a great thesis, come back with a 20-page results, but I say to it, you didn't quite think of this, and it'll go off and produce another 20-page thesis on something completely different. How do you tackle that in these contexts?
So that's a good question. You're referring to the sort of prompt engineering component of working with a tool like this. And when it comes back, exactly. So at the moment, what we have is keyword search, right? And in keyword search, you put in a key term, you might change the ending or add an asterisk to allow for multiple endings. And that's very limiting, because you can either find exactly what you're looking for or not find it. And that risks, I think, history becoming an elaborate exercise in confirmation bias. And the joy of a tool like this is you can challenge yourself to ask open-ended questions and ask a separate, similar question and see if that changes its emphasis or changes the number of sources it brings back. So you are quite right to say that the nature of the query is very determinative of the nature of the reply. It's very important, but not in the kind of one-to-one sense of speaking with a chatbot, where your query goes straight into the large language model and is the start point for its calculation and its response. With retrieval augmented generation, your query determines the sources that are retrieved. So even if you phrase your query several different ways, it might still retrieve the same 100 sources. So I think with RAG, it's a little bit more robust to the exact phrasing of the prompt, but it's a great question. What time for one more? Actually, we're slightly over time, but I'll allow it. One more. Yes.
Given that this is generated off of public appearances, do you think it would be possible or even useful to have an AI audience alongside it to sort of cheer or clap or gasp when they might?
That's an intriguing prospect. I hadn't thought about doing that. I'll bear that in mind. What a nice idea, the AI audience. I was hoping it would be a kind of a real audience reaction to the speech, but maybe AI would do as well. Of course, this was FDR's first ever debate. Presidential debates didn't really become a thing until the late 40s, 50s. So FDR never gave a debate. So you were his audience. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much.